America needed teachers to basically work in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, which were springing up all over the country. The United States had been somewhat distinct in offering free public education to its citizens in the 19th century. Education schools were the answer. They just happened to be on the rise and expanding all over the country at the same time, and this is the coincidence, when progressivism was the political rage. So this need not have happened, but it just did. You had someone like Claudine Gay, who was suddenly a defender of free speech. But what you cannot do is spend most of your career promoting microaggressions and trying to get people fired for misgendering and all sorts of other things.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. I'm delighted today to have Professor Lyell Asher. He's an associate professor at Lewis and Clark College in English. He's wrote a definitive piece really several years ago. I think it might have been 2022, Lyell, if I'm not mistaken.
Further back, actually, 2018, I think.
Really? That far back?
Yeah, that far back.
On higher education, schools being a menace to higher education.
Yes.
It was in Quillette. I think it might have been published afterwards in the Chronicle of Higher Education, or one of the key higher ed publications as well.
Yeah, it was first published in the Chronicle and then went to Quillette. Yeah.
I got it. Okay.
Yes.
So, fast forward, I guess, many more years, 7 years now. And it's amazing to see how prescient you were at that time. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I mean, I'm going to add some context first, though.
Sure.
We're facing, an ideological onslaught in K through 12 education, much like we did in higher education. And it came from a series of things that happened in higher education. It jumped the lab from higher education in a way, and to understand what needs to change in K through 12 education, you really have to understand where it came from and how it got here, so
Yes.
we know how to reverse engineer it.
Exactly.
And so I'd love for you to talk about how it got here.
Okay. It's a complicated story, but I think I can give you a basic plot, and I think it will be helpful. Now, I've gotten this plot from many, many sources. It's taken years, really, to put it all together. I won't go back 200 years, but I'll just go briefly back to the early part of the last century. And there was a strange coincidence. Education schools, or teacher training schools, really got a boost in the early 1900s, especially in the teens, because America needed teachers to basically work in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, which were springing up all over the country. The United States had been somewhat distinct in offering free public education to its citizens in the 19th century. Of course, it really took off and it was becoming compulsory. And so what were we going to do to find all these teachers? So education schools were the answer. They just happened to be on the rise and expanding all over the country at the same time, and this is the coincidence, when progressivism was the political rage. So this need not have happened, but it just did. So from the very beginning, there was a progressive stamp on education schools, and it's really never left it. So fast forward to the other major coincidence, and this has to do with higher education. And that's the expansion of college education and universities in the late 50s and early 60s. So here's a statistic that I think is helpful. In 1965, there were about 4.5 million people enrolled in higher education. In 10 years, 1975, that number had jumped to 10.5 million. So in that period, we doubled the number of people in higher ed. And of course, you had to have professors to teach them. So we doubled the number of teachers. Now, in those days, and I've talked to some of my older colleagues, all retired now, getting a job in higher education was pretty simple. And it was done very quickly, sometimes at a bar at one of the conferences, and somebody said, "Hey, we need somebody to teach English at such and such college. Are you available?" They said, "Sure." That was how desperate colleges and universities were to have
Mm.
professors. Well, the other part of the coincidence is here that, as you know, David, and many of your viewers will know too, 1965 and 1975 was a time of political upheaval in the United States, especially on colleges and university campuses. Whether you think that upheaval was good or bad is almost irrelevant. The fact is that in that decade, the university was overrun, especially among uh, people aspiring to graduate education, by leftist dogma. And that has been really the thing. It's amazing to think about this. Just, we're always talking about the problems that the Vietnam War caused, both at home and abroad. I think the biggest and most long lasting problem that was brought about by the Vietnam War is higher education and K through 12 education.
The long march through the institutions.
Absolutely. And it never stopped because, and maybe your viewers know this, but it's very obvious if you're in higher education. People enter graduate school, and you go to graduate school for the most part to get a degree so that you can become a professor. And you learn from your professors, and they tend to, not always, but they tend to favor people who agree with them. And
How about
so,
that?
over a period of 30 or 40 or 50 years, you have a mass production of the same kind of political values that you had in 1965 through 1970. And that's why
Mm.
the universities and colleges are so far left leaning. Of course, they've always been that way, and to some extent, that's a good thing. To the extent that they shouldn't necessarily just mirror, what's going on in society. But now they're so far on the outside edges of what would be thought of as sort of the common understandings of most Americans that they've really been causing problems, and that's where it all starts. Now, there's more to say
Hmm.
about the connection between teachers' colleges and and higher ed itself, but maybe I'll
Right.
I'll stop there, and you can.
Yeah. I just want to reflect on one thing you said about the disconnect between the values of higher education and the larger society. When we had those fateful December 5th hearings of college presidents, I think it was December of 2023, um, it was it was so stunning in a way because you saw on full display how the values of higher education were out of sorts with the mainstream values when you brought those college presidents before members of Congress who represented a more sort of normie perspective. And I think it shocked the nation in that these are people who are just not like us in many ways, and and don't see the world the way we do. And you can almost imagine a college president who may not be necessarily a public intellectual or concerned about. They're an administrator. They're a political force. You can imagine them um, thinking in one corner of their mind, "What is the faculty going to do if I say X? How is this going to land locally for me?" And trying to balance that with this dialogue with normie people, and you can see it's an impossible task because college culture had become so far afield.
To anybody in higher education, maybe people outside it wasn't surprising to me that those presidents had such trouble answering what appeared to be easy questions. It's because they were speaking to three audiences and trying to satisfy them all, and they couldn't. I'll add one thing to that, David. The other thing that was most striking was that you had someone like Claudine Gay, who was suddenly a defender of free speech. I, for one, think, I'm pretty much an absolutist. And although I disagree vociferously with the sentiment expressed when people say, and I think I know what they mean, from the rivers to the sea, Palestine shall be free. I think that's probably protected speech under the Constitution.
Yeah.
People can disagree about that, but what you cannot do, on the one hand, is spend most of your career promoting microaggressions and trying to get people fired for, misgendering and all sorts of other things. And then suddenly, when you're called before a congressional hearing and they ask you about what for some people is considered to be anti-Semitic rhetoric, suddenly come off as if you are the greatest champion of the First Amendment that has ever been born. And so
No one believes it.
no
No one
one
believes
believes it.
it.
Not at all. That's
Right.
right.
Right. I think they were coached by lawyers who didn't understand the larger political context in that as well. They could have said I think they could have said one of two things that might have gotten them some safety, which would have been, um, we ought to believe in free speech, and we haven't done a good job of living up to it. And
Yes.
we're going to do a better job with everybody in all in every respect. Or they could have said, "Look, we're not free speech institutions, but we haven't done a very good job of applying our rules to Jews."
Yes.
They had one of two choices. I would have preferred the former, not the latter.
Yes.
But they didn't do either. They had to take some responsibility for what was the glaring hypocrisy of their statements.
Yes.
The Let's go to, though, now, how did it creep into ed schools and the role that ed schools specifically have played in promulgating this ideology?
Sure. So this is the strangest part of the story, and I'll tell you, you know, that essay that I wrote in 2018, I was very fortunate because I'm at a small college and I just happened to be in a position that I could see what was going on. And I also had a couple of friends and acquaintances who were on the staff side. And it allowed me to see something that probably wasn't visible to almost anyone else just because of this strange circumstance. It almost came down to where you were on a particular hall in a particular building. It's very strange. But I began noticing some very strange behaviors among newly hired staff people. Now, these people were not just, I'm not talking here about deans and presidents, I'm talking about what are called student facing administrators. And I noticed these, offices being developed like student engagement, multicultural engagement, DEI was starting then. And at the same time, I noticed there was, some intense prosecutions of students who were, um, being, in some cases, prosecuted quite extensively for innocent mistakes. In fact, two of the three cases that come to mind, these were students of color who were mistakenly thought to be racist because they were using the N word or putting up posters that people didn't agree with. And then when the administrators found out that, in fact, there had been a misunderstanding, and that, in fact, the students who were being charged and indicted for these supposed crimes were themselves minority students, one of whom was a far left minority student who'd just been misunderstood. Well, they were in a bit of a pickle.
Hmm.
Instead of admitting it, of course, they prosecuted them anyway. And so I got into this by fighting for these students and basically
Wow.
uncovering this. So then I began thinking, I wonder if this is going on elsewhere. And I began looking around, uh, and the web was very, very helpful, obviously. Fire was showing me the same thing happening at colleges and universities. And this was quite a mystery. So I did a little research and I began just Googling names of administrators who were doing this. And one thing I noticed, 9 out of 10, I mean, I kept a running chart. I had about 150 of these people on a list, and I just checked on their backgrounds. 90% of them had ed school degrees.
Wow.
And that was something that, here's the thing, college and universities, for the most part, they don't have much to do with K through 12 education. Even college professors don't or didn't really have a clue about, where high school teachers went to get their degrees, or even if they had to have degrees in education. So it was a learning experience for me. I had to go back and look at these ed schools and what they were doing. And what I discovered was that in the early 2000s, education schools, which had typically been devoted entirely to training K through 12 teachers and training them quite badly, by the way, saw an opening in colleges and universities. And that opening came about, again, I'll just talk a little bit about another historical coincidence. In the 90s, when we were recovering from the 87 recession, colleges and universities just saw a beautiful future in front of them. Students were increasing, the numbers of students were increasing every year. Their endowments were growing in part because of this dot-com boom. And they might have known, but they didn't care about the fact that in 2010, it was going to reach a peak of about 21 million students. And from that moment on, it was going to be declining. And that's where we are now. But one of the things that happened, there was such a rapid increase in the number of students going to college, they began taking positions away, administrative positions away from college professors, and handing them to administrators. Well, no college professor is going to object to that if he doesn't have to, become a dean of students or an associate dean of students, when you can hire somebody else to do that job for them. So that was the foot in the door. And then in the early 2000s, education schools began offering degree programs that gave these administrators who were now working in colleges degrees that would allow them to move up the ladder in colleges and universities. And because ed schools, and this is a slightly separate topic, are even further to the left than colleges and universities were at the time. They were the most extreme of all the schools in the United States. The ed schools were the most extreme. They began offering degrees, and they were degrees in things like, and these are things that were just invented: higher education management, equity and social justice. You can have a degree in higher education itself. Now, no one knows what that's about. There's no scholarship one has to master on the history of higher education, but it got them PhDs, and then they got in these positions in universities, and then they began, and you probably know this, they began teaching, not in classrooms, but in dormitories. Mm. And the biggest, I suppose, the watershed moment was at the University of Delaware in 2007. And this is when this massive experiment was tried. I say experiment was tried. It was thought to be a permanent program in which two Delaware administrators, both of whom had ed school degrees, James Tweedy and Kathleen Kerr were their names, and they imposed this, what can only be called a kind of indoctrination regime on entering students at the University of Delaware. And it became probably the biggest story that FIRE ever covered. And what it involved were getting RAs, resident advisors, who were mostly, juniors and seniors in college, to deliver what they called a curriculum. And the curriculum involved asking students, for example, how do you feel about other races? Do you date other races? If so, why? If not, why not? They would have these quote unquote seminars in which students were brought together, and they were asked to think of all the racial stereotypes they could think of and write them down in full view of other people who were targeted by those stereotypes. I mean, you couldn't actually believe it if it weren't there in black and white. Well, so anybody who's interested in that, just go on FIRE's website, the Foundation for Individual Rights. I think it's now called Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. It used to be education, but they've expanded their reach. And you can read the whole story, and I promise you, You simply will not believe it. Even more astonishing, and then I'll wrap this chapter up, is the fact that both of these supervisors of this program, instead of being fired or at least demoted, were promoted among the ranks of college administrators. They became heroes because now, and this is the other part of the story, college administrators could now really think of themselves as educators. And they thought now that it was within their purview to deliver a kind of curriculum. And so everything that has followed from that, offices of educational equity, offices of quote unquote sustainability, the massive numbers of bureaucratic arms that are now in universities that have nothing to do with academics. That's really where it came from. And once they're there,
Mm,
it's impossible to get them out, David,
yeah.
because as you rightly intuit, no college president ever wants to be on the record for having gotten rid of an office that's supposedly increasing and exercising their judgments in the production of equity and inclusion. It's just not going to happen.
Right. So it seems like it actually created two problems simultaneously. One is that reinforced through bureaucracy the existing ideological biases in the university system. And two, it was now preparing a generation of K through 12 teachers in the exact same ideological tendencies that we had in higher education and setting them up to do the same in their classrooms. Is that right?
Exactly right. And here's the pernicious part of this, David. You know, there have always been ideologues in colleges and universities, and sometimes those people can be useful. I've took a class from a committed Marxist. I learned a great deal about Marxism. I wouldn't ever
Yeah,
want that guy
sure.
fired. He was a
Yeah.
true believer, and in the same way, I might want to take a religion class from a true believer. Um, but the difference is that if the ideologue was known to be one who wouldn't tolerate dissent and wasn't really teaching, you could at least avoid the class most of the time. But you can't opt out of having a dorm room. You can't live off campus as a freshman. There's no escaping some parts of the campus bureaucracy. And these aren't classes you sign up for. These are part of the institutional fabric, which students simply can't escape. And
So how does that happen that these ed schools were able to bureaucratize the dorm room? Explain what happened there.
well, that again, that's the amazing story. What they did at University of Delaware is they simply said, well, we have these. They have an ed school, an education school. And by the way, for people who don't know what an education school is, it's a kind of loose term that covers uh, any undergraduate program that you can major in education in. But most of the time, we're talking about graduate schools where teachers go to who already have a BA or something, but who want to be K through 12 teachers, and they will go for probably 1 or 2 years. Most of the time, it's a or sometimes a 3 year program to get their master's in teaching and teaching certification. And so, one of the things they do in schools throughout the nation is they say, well, we'll have a dorm supervisor who is a ed school graduate. And by the way, one of the arguments they use is, well, um, these people have degrees in higher education, and sometimes they will have sub degrees and have taken classes in dormitory management. And in the old days, that was just like have a degree in how to be somebody who runs a hotel. you know. But now it's been infused, and for the last 20 years, it's been infused with ideology. So and in the case of Delaware, um, Kathleen Kerr, I think she was head of dormitories, student housing, and the cafeteria, if I'm not mistaken. I know that sounds insane, but she was then in charge of all these people who were going to be RAs. Well, it wasn't very hard for her to say, okay, so we have a curriculum we would like you to deliver. And the students who were RAs, and by the way, we know for a fact that some of these students who objected to the curriculum were threatened with loss of employment. Well, they really didn't have any choice in the matter. So they had to
Mm,
deliver this nonsense and highly ideological curriculum, whether they liked it or not. And that has gone on, uh, to varying degrees in just about every college and university in the country.
amazing. So, to complete the higher ed K through 12 loop, how did we start to see K through 12 educators that were deeply influenced by this ideology?
Well, in some ways, is happening simultaneously. Now, let me just point out that there are a lot of good-hearted, well-intentioned, and fine teachers out there in the trenches of K through 12 education.
No doubt.
But it's one of the problems is that going to most ed schools in the United States today, if you can put up with the ideology, um, it's hard for it not to sort of seep into your own thinking. And if it's something that you object to strenuously, and I have former students who dropped out simply precisely because of this, then they're weeded out. So what you have are, and by the way, when they get to the institution, to the school, very often they're surrounded by people who went to the same programs who may very well be true believers. And even if there are only a few of them on the staff at the school, it's very difficult for people to oppose what sounds like nothing but, virtuous behaviors. So, for example, when you say, look, I'm for equity and inclusion, it's very difficult to say, no, I'm against those things. I think
Right.
somewhere I was talking about how, Reagan called, I think, a nuclear missile or a ICBM a peacekeeper. That was very shrewd on his part.
Hmm.
Whether, regardless of how one thinks about Reagan, it was a very shrewd move because
Yeah.
it disarmed his critics. Well, for the same reason, it's very difficult to criticize equity and inclusion. And so
Yeah.
in high schools, again, it's not everywhere and it's not to the same degree everywhere, but high school teachers have a kind of, very often they will have this enormous pressure to comply. And if they're, by the way,
Yes.
if they're going to get their degrees through ed schools, they have to comply typically with what have been called dispositions. Many years
Mm.
ago, the actual accrediting agencies for K through 12 ed schools made dispositions, and dispositions just meant um, um,
Sounds like
ideological
inquisitions.
ideological conformity. Made that one of the requirements for an ed school to get accredited. So that's
Yeah.
where we got it. But of course, this all comes from universities. All these things, it's in a loop, it's in a cycle. So it's very hard to figure out
Yes.
exactly where it starts. In some ways, it doesn't matter, but they're
Right.
all in this together.
Yes, they are. So let's talk a little bit about what to do about it. I know you've had some ideas about higher education reform, presumably that would impact ed schools as well. What is your thinking on that?
Well, maybe David, I'll talk about, and this is not going to be. I'm an optimist, but I'm pretty pessimistic on this. So let me just I've been looking at a lot of proposals that people make. So I'll just run
Hmm.
through a couple and tell you some of the problems with them,
Hmm.
and maybe we can speculate on how we might crack this nut. So
Hmm.
I was listening to Victor Davis Hanson about 6 months ago, and I always like to listen to him. I like to hear what he says. Don't always agree with him, but he's interesting
Right.
and certainly against the grain. One of the things he said
Yes.
was, and this is, you understand why he would say this, what we need to do is abolish tenure and turn everything over to 5-year contracts. And I heard that and I immediately thought that that would make the problem worse for a number of reasons. And I say that as somebody, who has enjoyed tenure, but, I'll be retiring sometime in the future. So I don't really have a personal stake in this. The problem is that tenure is the only bar against colleges and universities firing people who make noise, people like me. Um,
Hmm.
so that if you think there's no criticism now, because people with tenure are not, by the way, endowed with some fierce amount of courage
Right.
or a serious amount of courage. Just the opposite, in fact. But there will be absolutely zero once you get rid of tenure. The second problem with that is that we already have very low standards, and grade inflation is just out of control. When you make employment um, based on entirely based on student satisfaction, it will get even worse. And that's hard to imagine because it's hard to know. We're going to run out of A's to give people before long. We're going to have to change the grading scale. Because when you don't have the protection of tenure, and this is one of the problems too with having universities employ lots and lots of adjuncts. Adjuncts are not stupid. They know that their job security depends on being liked by students and on students signing up for their courses. If nobody has tenure, uh, pleasing students will be job one, and and the lower standards will get still lower, and the grades will inflate even higher. Now, normally you would think that we have deans and presidents who will hold the line on standards, but this goes back to an earlier point you were making when you said you're talking about the college presidents, who were appearing before Congress and they were worried about what their constituents are going to say. College deans and presidents really have no interest whatsoever in holding the line on standards or lowering grade inflation, for the simple reason that it's not going to do anything to increase enrollments or even keep enrollment steady. And that's one of the big problems facing higher education. People are worried about losing students. And the other thing that's changed is that deans and presidents are now, they occupy this class, and I'm not here talking about um, ed school graduates. I'm talking about people who typically have PhDs if you're a college president or a dean of the college at a university or a college. Um, they occupy a particular class of administrators who, more than ever, are constantly thinking about their next job. They want to constantly be moving up the ladder. So in the old days, you would have college presidents who would be around, sometimes for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. We still have a few of those. I think Leon Botstein has been at Bard for maybe 40,
Very, very long time.
40
Right.
years, but he is such an exception. It would never happen today. And so college deans and presidents, one of the last things they ever want to do is have a record of having increased standards and uh, and called out grade inflation, because that leaves their faculty in with in very bad moods, and then that follows them when they apply for a job elsewhere. It's why
Mm,
colleges, deans and presidents are not leaders anymore; they're followers. They
right.
have to constantly be
So
worrying about how they're
yeah.
pleasing or not pleasing their faculty.
So tenure is not going to solve the problem. I mean,
No,
removing tenure is not going to solve the problem.
yeah,
What about these centers for civic thought that have been established in several universities around the country? I don't know. There might be around 13, 14 of these programs now in various places. These are sort of bastions of classical liberal education within universities that have been largely given over to these ideological tendencies. There's the theory of change, if you will, there is that those places attract great academic talent and student talent,
yes,
and over time might sort of eclipse the really lousy humanities or social science programs that exist elsewhere.
yes,
That exist in the larger university. And maybe you could even do something like that with high, ed schools as well. You could have ed schools that are really high caliber to teach master teachers and that really teach them according to the cutting edge techniques and the like, and not with these sort of academic fads. What
yes.
what do you think? What do you think about that as a proposal for shifting higher ed?
So let me first talk about higher ed and then talk about ed schools. As far as higher ed goes, that I think is the best idea. It's the one idea that has promise, and I'll say why. The other idea that has promise is, and my friend Peter Boghossian has ventured this, and I have to say I agree with
Hmm.
him. I think he's to the point now and got there maybe a year before I did, which was there's just no saving universities. So the only thing that you can possibly do is start new institutions.
Like
So
UATX
yes, but the problem with that is um, that is a
takes forever.
heavy lift, and even if you're
Yeah,
halfway successful, then like University of Texas at Austin, the problem there is as wonderful as that idea is, um, are you going to be able to attract students who then might be worried about having a degree from what is thought of wrongly, I think, as a conservative school? Well, sure,
yeah,
that's good if you're maybe getting a job at Daily Wire or some other place that doesn't mind your conservative background. But a lot of students are not interested in that. I wish them all the best. I hope it does work. And of course, that's just one school. There are 5,000 institutions of higher ed, and that's one in 5,000. What your proposal, these schools of civic education, I think that's the best possibility because you already have a university in place. And then if you have a wealthy donor, and I think that's what it takes, a wealthy donor who will bring to the university money for faculty, for programs and outside visitors and guest speakers. Uh, most most college presidents and boards will be interested in that. I think that's the best possibility for really transforming higher education.
yeah. Seems to me the most plausible as well. Well, what about the president of the United States coming in and threatening to defund colleges?
No,
You hear on the let me steel man it for a second.
sure.
You could argue that people like you and people like me who like to write opinion pieces for Quillette are not going to sort of move the needle on that. But when the federal government comes in with its heavy hand and threatens it, yes, it might overreach, but in the process, it might shake things up so much that you could imagine seeing a liberalizing of these institutions in order to meet the Trump, some of what Trump is proposing. You could also imagine, and this is the argument against it, I think, is that it'll just replace it with an alternative form of illiberalism. So where are you on that?
Well, I don't think there's any chance of a alternative form of liberalism taking over. So, but in other words, I'm not worried about that side of it. I mean, it could happen, I suppose, but I think it's definitely the case that the only possibility of transforming the universities will have to look bad on the outside because there is simply no way of making any differences in colleges and universities by, as the critics will say, using a scalpel.
Right.
It simply doesn't work. The problem that Trump and any you know reformer will run into is the fact that any kind of top-down attempt to transform institutions which are filled to the brim with people who are opposed to you, there are 1,000 ways to get out of and to just pretend that you're going along with the program when you're not. Now, money is a different matter. I'm a little concerned about the um, threats to academic freedom that this poses. I'm very concerned about it. However, there is really no academic freedom to speak of at universities now, and there hasn't been for a long time.
Right. Right. It's like that's the problem. It's like, well, I remember when the issue emerged in Florida, of what do they call it? Divisive concepts. In other words, Governor DeSantis and the Republican Party were trying to ban the teaching of divisive concepts, namely critical race theory,
Yeah.
in colleges in K through 12. And I don't want them to ban the teaching of divisive concepts, but it was spoken as if what currently exists in these schools, whether K through 12 or higher education, was actually free exchange of ideas, which is not the case. In other words, in
Yes.
some ways, you're saying, what would I rather, my kid be indoctrinated in your ideology, or would I rather you ban the discussion of that? And if you ask me to pick my poison, I might say I would rather ban the discussion than indoctrinate my kid in something. And
Yes.
unfortunately, no one seems to want to say, well, let's just teach your divisive concepts and make sure we show multiple sides of it.
Yes.
And so I don't know how to break this log jam we have without doing something akin to what Trump is doing. That doesn't mean I want him to do everything he's planning. I don't want him to necessarily take away Harvard's 501c3 status or threaten to take it away or insist that certain things are taught. Make
Yeah.
but I don't know. A lot of the people who are objecting aren't really facing up to the nature of the problem that we have right now in higher ed.
Yes, I think the problem is so bad that any solution is also necessarily going to be bad. There's just
Right.
no way around it. And I'll just have to you just sort of have to wait and see and see what happens. Maybe something will come of this issue about funding. I don't know. But even if it works at Harvard, and again, I'm somewhat skeptical. Well, that's one out of 5,000 institutions,
Yes.
and and they're not all as bad as Harvard, but they all have. Most of them will have exactly the same problem. As far as ed schools go, let me go back to this one issue. There is some movement on one particular front that doesn't have so much to do with ideology, though it does in a perverse way, and that has to do with the failure. And this is the biggest problem. And this is where ed schools are the most vulnerable. The failure over 40 years to teach even the most basic but most important skill of all, which is how to teach children how to read. You've maybe
Right.
heard of this.
The whole language versus the phonics debate. And we've
Yes,
known for years that
yes,
phonics by and large is a superior method of teaching kids. Maybe that whole language works for kids in upwardly mobile households that are where they're teaching their kids actually probably something akin to phonics when they're 6 years old. So by the time they're in second grade, they already are reading well, and you can teach all the whole language you want. They're already reading. But for any other kid who hasn't taught at home, phonics is what you would want to teach them.
yes, absolutely. And this is the big mistake they made. And this debate, believe it or not, David, this goes back. You may know this. This goes back
Yeah.
almost 100 years, because even the Dick and Jane series, or I don't know, I grew up with the Alice and Jerry series, which was the second
I grew up with Dick
generation.
and Jane.
Oh, okay.
I had Dick and Jane. Yeah.
So it's the look say, and this was the early version of, believe it or not, the sort of whole. They didn't call it that, but it was the whole word movement. And now, you weren't harmed by it. I don't think I was harmed by it. I got a little phonics instruction when I was at school in the first and second grade, because there was a window between 1963, I think, and around 1970, where you got a little bit of both. And then that window closed. But the phonics instruction, as you point out, was given at home for people who had parents and siblings who were interested in their kids' education, who had time to actually sit down with them and read. But the very students, and this is the really tragic irony
Yes.
of ed schools, the very students who they claim to be so interested in and to be uniquely skilled in helping, that is, and you always hear them talk about the marginalized, the Black students, the Hispanic students, the students who come from broken homes and impoverished neighborhoods, they're the ones who suffer the most, because if schools don't teach them how to read, and what your parents and my parents call sounding it out,
Mm-hmm.
if the schools aren't teaching those kids, they won't get it. And so when you have kids, and this is common now, in some of the poorest neighborhoods in the country, you have eighth graders barely reading at a third grade level. We know what the problem is, and we've known it for years, for decades, really. But ed schools have been absolutely refusing to make any changes at this. Now, here's the bright side.
But
There are
what does that
now,
have to do with ideology? Like, why would
yeah,
this crazy ideology that we have affect the way that they want to teach kids how to read?
good question. They tried to put this, by the way, and believe it or not, in Fidel Castro's Cuba.
Right.
And Castro and his ministers of education immediately saw the stupidity of it and got back to phonics very quickly. Well, the United
Uh-huh.
States, United States uh, was never able to do that. In fact, I have a book here. You'll appreciate, David. I got this on eBay several years ago.
Uh-huh.
And you will immediately recognize what it's recalling. This is the whole language catalog. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
facing the right direction, but
I've seen that book before. Yes.
yes. And it's based
I've come
on,
across
remember
it.
what was it called? The Whole Earth catalog. Remember that? It was this
Yeah, yeah.
sort of 60s hippie catalog where you would have,
Right.
on the same page, you'd have tents and LL Bean shoes and then, you know, tie dye shirts and all this. Well, so they immediately associated themselves, and it would be interesting to delve into the history of how this came to be, but they immediately associated themselves with a progressive movement. It's almost part of the wording, hey, we like,
Right.
just like we like whole grains and whole foods, we also like whole language.
Right.
And
Right. Phonics sounds very,
oh,
very like sort of politically right wing and and sort of formulaic. Whole language,
yes,
that sounds like something that ought to work,
yes,
right?
well,
It sounds
absolutely. And the idea, the idea was, and Ken Goodman was the guy who resurrected this thing back in the late 60s. He wrote a dissertation on the three queuing method, and this is how
yeah,
it got revived. But he actually said in the 90s in an essay, he was complaining then about, I don't know who the Secretary of Education was, but saying, oh, they were all right wing extremists. So anytime there was a criticism of whole language, all the critics were described as being right wing, sometimes even fascist. And so immediately, and from then on, it got that connection. And so ed schools
unbelievable.
have been just, yeah, it's insane. Ed schools have been pushing this. Now, again, the good thing about it is there are several bills in state legislatures, I think 12 or 15, the last count, which is amazing, to stop this. And Mississippi, and this is goes back to your question about what could maybe change ed schools. Mississippi went from the very bottom in reading scores to somewhere near the top in terms of their progress over the last 10 years. And this has entirely to do with their change in the way they teach reading. And that was a
Right.
legislative move. It came down from the top, and there was a lot of resistance to it. But Mississippi, of all places, Oregon, by the way, my lovely state, hasn't changed an inch. And I think we're down at 47 out of 50, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Yeah,
A lot of whole language in Portland.
a lot of whole
Yeah.
language in Portland.
Right. So it seems to me, maybe this is what we're getting at here, is that we've really got it. When we talk about the problems of K through 12, I mean, of course, talk, I can talk forever about critical race theory and DEI and the rest. But what we really need to talk about is the major slippage in standards and the poor performance of young people and how we're failing the most vulnerable people
Yes,
by crowding out the rudiments and not even really paying attention to what these kids need.
that's right.
And that's a far better message than just talking about the radical ideology in schools.
That's exactly right, because there's a barometer. We have a test, the nation's report card, which comes out every 2 years. We can
Yeah,
see
it
what the
just came
results
out.
are. And here's the other thing. This one of the mistakes I think the Trump administration made was in thinking that, we're going to turn, K through 12 education over to the states. Well, the truth is 90% of K through 12 education is already
It's
in the
already
states.
right,
Okay.
right, exactly.
So, but I'm, all for any kind of funding pressure that you could put on them to change. That's wonderful. But the one thing that will really make a difference and has made a difference, and there's some momentum in this, is when parents look at a neighboring state or a state across the country and say, why is it that we're ranked 47th in reading and math? And yet, a backward state like Mississippi, supposedly backward, is up in the top 10. What are we doing? And you actually
Right.
have statistics. It's very hard to actually nail down anybody when you say, "Oh, this is divisive content." Well, show me the statistics. Show me something concrete. What exactly are you talking about? This is where math and reading, you can really give them something quantitative that they can't really argue with.
Yeah. One last question. We've been we the last few days, the Supreme Court took up this case in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, of an opt out provision for parents to be able to opt out their kids of sort of gender ideology and sexual orientation books in class.
Yeah.
And it caused an uproar in our area. And in the end, the school refused to allow parents to opt their kids out. And there's now a Supreme Court case. What was fascinating, I mean, I've been listening to some of the questioning, and I think it might have been Brett Kavanaugh who was questioning the lawyer representing the school system, who was saying, this opt out provision is not practical because there's so much opting out of these classes. And it reminded me of how we started, Lyell, about the disconnect between higher education and the larger society. Like if there's that much opting out, maybe you're not representing a mainstream perspective in society. I don't mind schools being on the vanguard a bit, but if you're that disconnected from your parent base, maybe there's a problem.
Well, I did a series of videos with Peter Boghossian on YouTube called "Why Colleges Are Becoming Cults." And ed schools, I didn't talk a lot about ed schools. It comes up for here and there, but yeah, they're cultists. I mean, they are typically living in a hall of mirrors in an echo chamber, and it's shocking to them when they get outside among real people, average people. And by the way, you don't have to be conservative. I think this was made. This is a point made by Elena Kagan. Maybe, I don't know.
Yes,
And she said,
she was
you don't
quite
have
compelling.
You don't have to be a religious person to object to this. Absolutely.
Right.
I'm a non-believer. I object to it.
Right.
And the only political party I've been a member of is the Democratic Party. I left it, but I look at this stuff and say, this is totally insane. And it looked to me like, I don't know what your take on it was, David. It looked like this is going to go down
I think it's going to go down.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think it's going to go down. And I think it's important that it goes down. I mean, we have to sort of recalibrate the rights of parents and schools here. I mean, I'm not a purist when it comes to parental rights, and I think there are things that schools can teach that parents might not like at times. But to be this far afield of where parents are, and to enforce this upon every kid, just seems like a horrendous ideological project. And maybe it's that these excesses that sort of reorient our education system ultimately. We like to fight in places where we can't win because there's so many outrages in these places that oftentimes then you can raise awareness among the places that haven't gone that far down the rabbit hole about what can go wrong.
About what can go wrong and what it looks like when it comes over the hill.
Exactly.
And by the way, this is something, just the last little point here. One of the you said parents, when they actually see what's going on in these schools, this is one of the maybe only benefits of the COVID thing, when parents were staying home with their children, watching on Zoom and seeing what teachers were actually teaching and seeing what their kids were being exposed to. They don't get a chance to see this most of the time. And let's face it, David, the other problem is that parents are only connected with education for a fairly short period. Yes. Teachers and supervisors and administrators, they're in for the long haul. So they depend in some ways on parents growing out of the system and a new crop coming in. So I think this is, this is a very good sign. I think parents really got to see what's happening. And I think now there's a real chance for some reform.
I think so too. Lyell, it's been a pleasure having this conversation. It's amazing how you understood something that long ago that is really sort of coming to the fore right now. So I really appreciate your analysis and look forward to further conversations.
Thanks, David. My pleasure. And I'm looking forward to talking again.
Take care.
Bye-bye.